Welcome, everybody, to the Coaches Chronicle. I am very excited to share that we have Paul Karvanis with us here today. Paul, thank you so much and welcome to your feature interview.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here.
Okay, let's jump right in, my friend. You spent nearly 12 years in law, private practice at a top Canadian firm, in-house at a major international retailer, and then a crown agency. From the outside, that's a career that most people would envy. When did you first realize something was off?
Um, I I think first realized something was off pretty early on. I was in my second year at the law firm and I was on the worst file ever. The the material was boring, the client was demanding, the senior associate was riding me, and I was like, this is terrible. And then we got the pens down email, which means everybody put your pens down, this deal is done. So I remember being super happy, sending a note to my buddy. And then the next week, I got on a new file and I thought to myself, oh my God, this file is the worst file ever. Me last week was mistaken. This one's way worse. And then, wouldn't you believe it? A week later, I get another pens down email. And now I'm running down the hallway celebrating to my buddy's office. And then the following week, that first deal that died came back. And I thought, oh, no, no. Me from last week was wrong. This deal really was the worst ever. And I realized that they were all the worst ever. And that I was only really appreciating what I was going through in hindsight rather than actually in the moment. So that was my first sign that something was up. You're not actually happy right now.
Paul, you've written about feeling pot committed, trapped not by circumstances, but by the fear that the life you'd love didn't actually exist. Can you take us inside that fear?
Yeah, it's really hard to know that you're miserable and to know that you want something else and to not feel comfortable going for it. And since becoming a coach, I've worked with a number of people like this as well, where we sit there, we talk about how it's time to leave, how they want to leave, blah, 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 blah. And yet, week in and week out, we have the same conversations and nothing changes. And it took me a while to realize, as part of my own arc as a coach, what was happening. That they actually had multiple parts, and there was a part of them that was showing up to these calls that was incredibly afraid and desperately wanted to leave. And that there was another part that wouldn't let them leave. So I think that was my story. And I felt largely trapped and was only able to like make smaller moves at the margins. The good news is that as long as you're in motion, you're not stuck. And so I was eventually able to make enough moves where I felt like, okay, here I am. I'm getting momentum. I'm feeling confidence, that sort of stuff.
You describe a kind of ultimate failure, success after success, but still not feeling successful. Why do you think that pattern is so common among high achievers?
I think, first of all, there's a part of it that's specific to high achievers, but it's common to all of us, right? And the problem is we often don't know what's going to make us happy, right? Most of the people in our lives have their version of an I'll be happy when, right? Like, I'll be happy when I lose 5 pounds or 10 pounds or 20. I'll be happy when I get a different job. I'll be happy when I get a promotion. I'll be happy when I get a house or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a family. I'll be happy when I qualify for and run the Boston Marathon. Um, that last one's not that common, but it's in my head still, right? Like, I do this work. I wrote a book called The Happy Lawyer where I talk about this stuff. I still speak on it regularly. And I still have these um, thoughts in my mind that says this is the one piece that's missing. But that's ridiculous. Of course, it's not the one piece that's missing. So I think the big problem is a lot of us don't really realize we're wrong about what will make us happy. And so we, in the high achieving part, people in particular, generally achieve what they set out to achieve. And so they've got this idea of what will make them happy and they achieve it and they realize they're not. And so they think, okay, I must have picked the wrong thing. So they set a new goal. And then the goalpost keeps moving. I call that goalpost drift. And as you get close to it, it moves away from you. So I think that's why high achievers in particular can be vulnerable to this because they do, in fact, achieve their goals. And oftentimes they get there and realize nothing's different.
When you were practicing law, you had friends, colleagues that were happy practicing while you weren't. What did that contrast stir up in you, and where did it eventually lead?
Well, it led to me starting my Happy Lawyer project, where I interviewed over 100 lawyers, happy, miserable, and in between, trying to find the patterns of what makes people happy. And that ended up in this book, The Happy Lawyer, which I wrote. I think that my initial hypothesis was happy lawyers are happy because they're passionate about the work. They actually like the law. We work a lot, and it must be that. And yet it was so fascinating to me when I started the interview process. I found happy lawyers who are not passionate about the law. And I found unhappy lawyers who were passionate about the law. And I realized that actually maybe this passion variable that I thought was so important is not as important as I think it is.
So you mentioned you were looking for a pattern, and what did it reveal instead after 100 interviews?
So I did find a pattern. The first one was the how, and then the second one was the what. So the how happy lawyers got happy. They all did the same thing. They were all self-aware. I would ask them questions, they would have answers. They thought about it before. And yet, if you were, for the lawyers who were only self-aware, they were actually stuck and felt pretty miserable. And so they needed self-awareness, but they also needed to be taking action because taking action is how you avoid getting stuck. And that was it. It was they had self-awareness, which informed their action, which made it intentional action, and then back into the self-awareness. So they reflect, take a step, do it all again. That was the first pattern. And that was how they got happy, which was not what I wanted to see, right? Like I like to tackle things sequentially to achieve them and move on. And I was hoping to be able to treat happiness like that. Let me get happy and then I can put my focus on something else and I'll be happy forever. But that just wasn't how it worked. Life changes, we change. And so the people who weren't constantly looking at it and being aware in their lives and taking action and being intentional, their happiness didn't last.
Hmm.
So that was the first pattern, which was the biggest. And if someone follows that pattern, everything else is going to work itself out.
There's a turn in your story where
Yeah.
you realized building the right life circumstances wasn't enough on its own, and that you had to become a different person inside of those
Yeah.
circumstances. What cracked that open for you?
The second pattern was the what people focused on. And I'm going to get back to the actual answer to your question. Um, so how they did it, what did they actually do when they were taking action? Well, they focused on their community, the people around them. They were self-compassionate, nice to themselves. They prioritized their health. They weren't perfect, but they did their best. They pursued excellence constantly. And regardless of ever having hit it, they were in constant pursuit of it. And then they also lived in alignment. So it was those five things in order. And I came to realize that my kryptonite was the self compassion piece. I wasn't very nice to myself. I had achieved a whole bunch of stuff and I did it by riding myself, raising the stakes, making everything seem like this was the end of the world. And so I would use that to motivate myself to get it done. But the problem is when you're constantly living in that stressful em- environment that I was creating in my head, which isn't to say there wasn't stress outside, right? I worked in a few pressure cooker environments over time. It was more, I always made it worse in my head as opposed to making it better. And so at some point I realized, like, oh, I've now built the life I wanted. I'm doing law less. I'm doing coaching. I have more balance. I have time to focus on hobbies. I also have my family, which I love to spend time with. This is the life I wanted. I'm still not happy. And that was what made me come face to face with, okay, well, if I'm still not happy, what's wrong? And I looked at it and realized, like, well, I'm killing it on all of these except for this one piece. So and that's, I think, what started this idea of trying to be more self compassionate, trying to be a different person in my life, where I didn't raise the stakes, where I still pursued excellence, but more just because it was fun rather than because I thought the world would fall apart if I didn't reach some somewhat arbitrary threshold, if that makes sense.
Mm. You frame your work around two levers, perspective and reality, and you insist people have to pull on both. Why both? And what happens when someone only works on one?
So I don't think you have to, right? I try to deal in always truths, not just sometimes truths. And the truth is that there are happy people who've only pulled one lever, right? Like if you look at the monks and the Buddhas, they've only been pulling on the perspective lever. In fact, they intentionally don't try to pursue things in the material world because it takes away from the other lever. And they're very happy. That was not going to be me, though. And up to that point, I'd lived the other version of it, trying to only pull the external lever and not the internal one. So, and that hadn't worked either. And that was where I realized for me, I need to be pulling on both. Not everyone is going to have to. It's really going to depend on their context. Like for someone who's already very self compassionate and who's just like in a situation that isn't great, maybe they only need to change the reality. But for me and for people like me, man, we got to do both, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because it is in taking action that our self awareness gets further developed, right? Like when we talk about the self awareness to intentional action loop, we focus on how self awareness informs action to make an intentional action. But the reality is that the action then reinforms the self awareness. And so we can get awareness through action that we never would have had at the start. And this is the classic overthinker's trap where they're waiting to take action and they're waiting until they've figured out everything that needs to be figured out before they take action. The problem is you often can't figure out everything until you're taking action. So, um, man, I forget your initial question, but I think,
Perspective and reality, and why pull on both?
yeah, I think so. That's the other reason to pull on both is because as you're pulling on one, it affects the other in a way that makes them more than the sum of their parts. There can actually be synergy there.
Mm. And the taking action reveals new perspectives or new intentionality.
Hmm.
Okay. Coaching wasn't an obvious next step from corporate law. So how did you find your way to it, and when did you know that it was for you?
So, my mentor back when I was in law, I think I was in house at the Bay at the time. She gave me a book called "How Will You Measure Your Life." It was written by Clayton Christensen, who taught business theory at Harvard. And at the end of the semester, he and his students would take the business theories and apply them to their personal lives. So it's a fascinating book. It's half business theory, half application of personal life. In it, he tells a story about Disney Paris. He says before they opened it, Disney had three of their theme parks. Those three theme parks averaged, what was it? People stayed for on average 3 days. They were opening up Disney Paris. They're trying to figure out how many guest days they were going to have per year. So they had a complicated formula based on like weather patterns and population densities that predicted about 11 million visitors a year. Well, people stayed at their other parks for an average of 3 days. So they figured, okay, people will have about 33 million guest days at this park per year, right? 11 million visitors times 3 days on average. And so they opened up the park and they start losing money hand over foot. They're just hemorrhaging it. Well, it turns out they were right on their formula. People, they were getting about 11 million people a year, but people were only staying for 1 day, not 3. Well, it turns out all of their other theme parks had on average 45 rides, and Disney Paris had on average had 15. So it starts to make sense why that basic assumption might have proven wrong. And what he says is you've got to test your assumptions, and you've got to start with those that are least likely to be true and with the most severe consequences if they're wrong. So I'm sitting there as a lawyer and I'm unhappy and I'm thinking through, okay, what could I do instead? I was speaking with my coach at the time. I was looking back over my life and I narrowed it down to 3 things. I was either going to own a retail store or become a fiction writer or become a therapist. Those were my 3. And as I sat there looking at those 3, wondering which one I would pick, I realized that I was making assumptions. Now, as a classic type A who achieved what he set his mind to, I didn't even question the assumption that I was going to succeed at it. I believed that I would no matter what. The assumption that I thought was true was, or the assumption I thought I was making was, I'm going to like this more. Right. Because if not, then fine. I switch my careers. I take another 5 to 10 years to build it back up, and I'm not any happier. It's the same shit, different pile. And so I thought, okay, well, what I have to do then is test my assumptions. Which one of these am I actually going to like to do? So, as a way of testing whether I wanted to be a therapist, where you have to quit, spend tens of thousands of dollars, do extra schooling, get accredited, blah, 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 I thought, well, let me test coaching because the real assumption is, am I going to like sitting with people one on one and talking about their problems? So I did my coaching courses. I started coaching in the evenings and on the weekends, and I realized I actually really like this. And in fact, the difference between coaching and therapy was better suited to me. The types of problems that people brought, who they were, what they wanted, I found it really worked well for me. And that was the start of something beautiful.
Indeed, it was. Let's talk about that start. So you and I both trained at the Coactive Training Institutes where we met, and you've gone on to earn your PCC with the ICF. What did that formal training give you that your years of law did not?
I mean, it's a totally different skill set, right? If we think about what it's like to cook a meal, um, cooking, like having something on the flame on the stovetop, is different a different skill than cutting something up, which is a different skill than baking, right? And so, law was one skill set, coaching was a totally different one, because in coaching you have to learn how to be with somebody. You learn how to relate to both them and the issue they're bringing, and the next level to yourself as you're relating to them, and realizing that, hey, if you're a chef in the kitchen, you're only as good as your tools, as the stove, as the pans, as the pots, as the knives. And as a coach, you're still only as good as your tools. And your tool, your main tool is yourself. And your secondary tool, I would say, is your skill sets. Um, so I found that the training itself was very important. I remember wondering whether I should stick with Coactive and become a CPCC or whether I should just get accredited with the ICF on my own. And I realized, like, look, I don't know where this coaching career is going to go, but I know that I want to be at the top of the game. Like, I want to be the best coach that I know. And so as soon as I realized that, it was a no-brainer. I had to stick with CTI to do my training with them. And I loved it. And there were some amazing people I met through it, and I got great training. And I even, as part of that, we had to get supervised calls, 2 calls, I think, supervised during the accreditation process. I kept in touch with one of my supervisors, and I worked with her on and off for years because I'm the tool, and I'm in constant pursuit of excellence. And even when I think I've gotten there, I somehow see another level to get to.
It's a great segue for the next question. Your your coaching focuses on the overlap between happiness and high performance. Why that overlap specifically, and what do most coaches miss when they treat them as separate?
The overlap specifically, I think I love the more complicated things. And so I think when we look at the overlap where there are extra variables, it just plays to my strengths better. Um, I never ended up pursuing it, but for a while I thought, you know what I should pitch myself as in terms of a coach is like someone who solves the issues that other people can't. Like call me, I'm the cleaner upper, the stuff that's not working otherwise. Um, and so I think that's the first step is it played to who I was. The second step is I believe that they're linked. I think that the happy you are, generally, the better you are at high performing. And certainly when I was looking at the happy lawyers and how most of them, most all, were at least at some level pursuing excellence. All of them were just at different levels of intensity. And so then I realized like, okay, well, even if you're going to look for happiness, for people like the ones I'd interviewed, you also need to have this pursuit of excellence. So I actually think that by focusing on the overlap and being intentional about that overlap, we end up improving both as compared with people where their mandate is to help someone be more successful and the person does, but they're miserable. By being intentional about the scope from the get-go, I find it helps.
The research behind your first book, The Happy Lawyer, also turned into a talk that you deliver regularly. When firms started inviting you to deliver that talk, they often wanted you to speak to incoming first years, but you knew that talk wasn't built for them. What did you do with that mismatch?
Well, first I complained about it. um, and then eventually I realized that the obstacle is the way and that this wasn't a problem, but in fact an opportunity. And so I asked myself, okay, well, if this message is not for first years, and it's really not because, like, if you're a first year going into one of the big firms here saying, like, what I want is balance in my life, I'm not going to work evenings and weekends, man, most firms are going to say, good for you, man. You're also not going to work weekdays. And even on the ones where they're okay with that, the reality is that those who are going to take their work more seriously are going to get better faster and they're going to leave you behind. They're just going to be better lawyers. And by the time they're fifth or sixth year, they'll have maybe even done an extra year's worth of work. But more importantly, the work they will have done will have been higher, not just higher quality, but more challenging, difficult work that push their boundaries because people want to give the work to those who want to do it. So it's a, I do think that juniors need to be focusing on getting better relentlessly, and I think that that goes far beyond just law. Any sort of professional services, and even outside of it, you'd be well served by just, hey, how do I get better at this? What are the critical competencies that go into my work? And how can I level up in each one of them? Maybe not all at the same time, but what's my plan? Um, you had a two-part question. I feel like I lost the second part there.
About the mismatch. So what did that?
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So the second part then is, okay, well, what is that? How did that end up being an opportunity? Well, I asked myself, what is if the happy lawyer message is not what juniors need to hear, what is the message? And then that came out of that my second project where I interviewed almost 50 managing partners, chief people officers, department heads, regular partners, talent directors, like leaders at firms who worked with associates and who were there to see which ones succeeded and which ones didn't, which ones looked promising and fulfilled their potential and which ones looked promising and somehow it turned sideways. And so to be able to distill that wisdom down, I created then my second book, The Successful Associate. And one of the big messages there is the one I talked about already, which is just like, look, as a junior, man, you got to get better. Like, it doesn't matter how good you are as a first year. If you don't improve by the time you're a fourth year, you're not good enough. So, what's far more important than how good you are is how good you are at improving. And I think that that was the message they needed to hear. And because I started this second project and looked past the obstacle through to the opportunity behind it, I was able to uncover that and now start to share it with others.
So to simplify then, that after these interviews with all of the stakeholders who want to see associates thrive, what in the research did you find separates associates who do thrive and those who fizzle out over time?
So I think of it, Maslow's hierarchy in the triangle. I think of it, there's a junior's hierarchy of success. And at the base of this triangle is quality work and reliability. If you're not doing quality work reliably, nothing else matters. People don't want to staff you. Nothing else matters if you can't do good work when you need it, when it needs to be done. Among those who can do that, some are really differentiated because they have people skills. They have the soft skills. They can talk to people. They can read a room. They can know when it's time to offer their idea and know when it's time to keep their mouth shut. And then among those who can do all of that, those who can take ownership, where they're both taking responsibility and taking initiative appropriately, not too much, not too little. If they can do that, then they're a next level associate. They're no longer a junior, now they're a mid level. And then what's asked of them switches again. So I think there's no one most common problem because different people fall at different steps of that hierarchy. The reality is, if you don't have the baseline, the table stakes, you're never going to have the opportunity to demonstrate the other parts, your ability to take ownership. Because if they can't trust your work, they can't trust your work, you're not going to get any. So it's you got to do each of these things.
You have two best-selling books now on Amazon as a result of this research and the work that you've put into this craft. What did writing them teach you about your craft as a coach that client work alone couldn't?
There's that old expression: if you want to learn, do. And if you really want to learn, teach. As a coach, we're not really teaching most of the time. We're guides, right? We walk with people, we walk beside them as they walk. When I wrote the books, I had to figure out how to teach and how to teach it in a way that met people where they were. For instance, one of the chapters and sections in The Successful Associate that I'm most proud of is the one where I break down your reputation and how important it is to your career and your image and your brand and how it feeds into that. And by image and brand, I mean both how you appear and also how you present, like your physical appearance and also just how you're moving through space. And then just tying one to the other, because I think that very often we want to show up in a certain way. We want to be authentic. I want to be this. I want to be that. And I agree completely. And I remember feeling that way too. And at the same time, I think that it's worth asking yourself, okay, really, what is the authentic me? Because when I was starting, authentic me was, you know, shorts on the weekend when it's warm, t-shirts, and like I go for runs and I do this and I'm not that pretentious and this and that. But like, if you think about it, I've actually just described a set of preferences to you. That's not a being. That's not authenticity per se. That's a menu of preferences. And so I remember at the time picking certain preferences and giving on some of them and other ones being like, I'm not willing to give on this one. And if it torpedoes my career, then so be it. But I think what I've come to realize now, with the benefit of all of these years of not just coaching, but my spiritual journey, my growth, all of the work piled on together, to realize that like who we are at our core is so much bigger and so much more beautiful than any of this stuff, any of these preferences on the menu, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Your company, Leader Rising, exists in your words to prepare the next generation of lawyers to lead the legal industry. What does that leadership look like, and why does the profession need it now?
I think every profession and society needs it now. I think we've always needed it. I think now, in particular, there's so many crazy things going on, right? Whether it's politics or conflict or the environment or the more local things that happen within, a 20-minute walk of where each of us lives. Like there's so many places where we can show up and be leaders and make a difference. So I think that that's always needed. And that's why it's needed. What does it look like? Well, I think to lead, there's a few different things. You need to matter, and then you need to take your responsibility to lead seriously. And so mattering looks different depending on who you are in the context, right? Sometimes you matter in the profession writ large because you are a leading practitioner and people trust your voice and want to hear what you have to say. Sometimes you matter because of the impact you're making on one individual, right? And I'm not putting one above the other. I'm just saying, like, look, you got to matter. And that in part too is where the focus on the pursuit of excellence comes from, because it's helpful if you want to matter in the industry. And then man, two-part questions, dude. What was the other part of that?
What does that leadership look like, and why does the profession need it now? I think we know why it needs it now. What does it look like?
I mean, it will look different for each individual, but I think the most common way is probably I'm going to do really well. I'm going to keep leveling up and getting better and gapping up until I exist in a class of one. And I am going to let myself express myself as who I am and who I want to be on that path. And I'm not going to be just falling into step because other people have. Right. And so it's a combination of that intentionality and excellence that together puts people at the forefront where they're thinking about their abilities and their impact.
You are and work with high performers who are used to being smartest in the room. What does it take to do real inner work with someone wired that way?
It's funny. What's coming up is a buddy of mine from undergrad. Um, I've always been one of the smartest people in the room. And coming through undergrad, I remember thinking like, if there's someone here who's smarter than me, I think it's this guy. And I reflected to him recently that more than almost anyone I knew, he was so good at talking himself into and out of things. He was just so good at convincing himself and rationalizing. And now, more than 20 years later, my God, uh, I was talking with him and I said, dude, this was always one of the things that was going on with you. And he's like, oh my God, you're so right. I wasn't able to see it before, but because of the growth I've undergone, because of how I realized my anxiety and my emotions had sort of always been steering the ship, I now finally see it. And I think that's just one example of how it can be really difficult when you're that smart because you can justify anything. And so it's really hard to realize what's true and what's not sometimes because in a way, you're creating your own truth so convincingly that you believe it. So that's just one example. I think that there's a number of different things that come up. Um, I think I'm well suited to helping those people because I hear in different layers and I understand the different things that are going on, and I've seen the different pitfalls in myself and my own journey. Um, and, at the same time, we're coaches and we're here to walk with everybody, right? So or we're here to walk with those who are called to walk with us. And sometimes my biggest teachers have been those where they just saw the world differently and more simply than I did.
Mm, beautiful. How often we learn so much through our clients.
Oh yeah. No, that's the a little secret of this industry is
The
how much
blessing
we
of
get
this
from
work.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah. That
Um,
the other blessing is you can't hide from it. Right? I
no.
think I could have been a miserable lawyer for a long time and done great in law. It's really hard to be a miserable coach.
Mm, indeed. Yeah. How do you show up as that? That's not even a question we want to answer
Yeah,
unnecessarily.
yeah,
Nobody tuned in here is that.
yeah.
Paul, you've delivered keynotes to audiences larger than 600. You've also spoken to small groups of 5 people at a time. What does the small room give you that the big one can't?
You get to see it land with each individual and you get to meet the individuals where they are. I find also like people aren't convinced because I convinced them. They're convinced because they see something that makes sense to them and they change their mind. And so if I'm presenting to a big room, I give my talk and I hope that it lines up. I hope that I've met them exactly where they are in a way that's going to move the needle. And when I'm in a smaller room and they feel comfortable enough to ask a question, they will. And then I can guarantee that I'm meeting them where they are, right? Whereas in a bigger room, they're just going to hold on to that question the whole time and it's going to introduce skepticism for everything after it. In a smaller room, when someone asks the question, one, you can answer it, they can let it go. And two, they start to have even more trust in you because look at this guy. He knows about the things that he's not talking about in addition to the things that he is.
There's a line in your writing. The one thing we don't risk is lying there at the end of our life, regretting the chances we didn't take. When you wrote that, were you speaking to your clients, your readers, or to yourself?
All of the above. All of the above.
Take us inside that line.
We've heard it from so many different places that the regrets are not about what you've done, it's about what you didn't do or didn't attempt. There was that woman who did her, I'm going to call it a project. She worked with people who were dying, and I think she wrote a book about like the 5 most common regrets of the dying. And I remember one of them being, I wish I'd lived a life that was more true to myself instead of to what I thought I was supposed to be doing or true to other people. Right. And so that's yet another example of someone who's been immersed in this spot in life and seeing the universal truth that we don't generally regret being authentic to ourselves and taking that risk when it makes sense. And we regret not doing it. And I think that I have needed convincing of that over time. And I have backed myself into changes that maybe I would have been better served by jumping into. But, you know, I also believe that all of this is happening for me. And so, yeah, it took longer for me, but I believe that it worked out the way it was supposed to and for the best.
Always does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think.
It, there's one other interesting thing about it, though. Can you repeat the question again? Because there was one other thing it brought up for me.
There's a line in your writing. The one thing we don't risk is lying there at the end of our life, regretting the chances we didn't take. When you wrote that, were you speaking to your clients, your readers, or yourself?
Particularly with lawyers, we are often cautious and risk averse. I don't know if cautious and risk averse people self-select to be lawyers. I do know that the industry trains us to be that way by rewarding us for spotting problems and for being cautious, blah, blah, blah. So I do think that there is a natural risk aversion in lawyers where we try to avoid the risks instead of taking them. And I mean, like if you look at the financial markets, the more like risk and reward are linked, not in every project, but in generally, you're going to get much better returns if you're willing to accept a certain level of risk. And it's also true in life that if we don't risk, we're just holding ourselves back. So there's something about that where not taking risks seems like the safest thing we can do. And yet, when you zoom out and look over the long term, it's actually one of the riskiest.
Hmm. Insightful. What's the question you're sitting with in your life, in your own life and work right now that you don't have yet have an answer to?
What is so if everything is happening for me, and if I believe that if I see the synchronicity and see how things that I initially didn't like and didn't want ended up working out for the best, then what is the balance between being a passenger and letting these things happen, knowing that I'm actually being taken care of? And that's on the one side. And on the other side is how much do I need to take charge and take agency and move forward? So, what's the balance between the two? If everything's working out for me, why not just rely on it too? But I also believe that we're meant to make things happen. So, I don't know. That's the thing I'm sitting with. It's like, what's the balance? Where do I fall in it? And I don't know the answer yet.
Where does it have you leaning?
It has me leaning. So, Michael Singer, who wrote the Untethered Soul, he wrote the Surrender Experiment, he wrote a bunch of things. He he's my unofficial guru. I love him. His book, The Surrender Experiment, in particular, was so fascinating because the other stuff is about theory and logic, and this one is about his life. And it's so fascinating to see its trajectory. And in particular, he often makes the point this thing that was happening that I didn't like ended up being for the best. And I've learned to just surrender to what's coming. But I sat with this book and tried to figure out exactly what it is. Like, what's the balance? How do we surrender and yet also have agency? And I've realized that his teaching is not about not having agency. In fact, I think he would be the first to say it's about throwing yourself into what it is you're doing with all that you are, realizing that that's you're just you. You're just watching and you're doing sometimes, or you're watching the you doing. There's no reason to be thinking about anything else or taking half measures or whatever. But what he does is he gives up on the direction. So he lets life give him the direction and then he throws himself into that direction with all that he is. And so I think that where I'm leaning on the balance of trust and agency is you assume full agency with zero attachment to outcome, just trusting that it's going to work out. I think that's it.
Trust.
Much easier said than done.
Indeed, my friend, indeed.
Yeah.
For a coach reading this who feels that same quiet misalignment you felt in your last years of practice, what's the first honest conversation they need to have with themselves?
I mean, the first thing is that they need to have an honest conversation with themselves. So I'm glad that they are. And then I think they need to sit down and lean into self awareness. Like, what's going on? Where is this breaking down? What's working? What's not working? Where are things that I think are working actually not working? And where are things that I think are not working actually working? Right. And they might not be able to get all of the answers to all of these things all off the get go, but you start to have that conversation with yourself and you take an itty bitty action and you use that action to inform your self awareness. And then you take another itty bitty action and there you go. And that's it. And you're in the cycle and you will get this. And remember too that, hey, in the grand scheme of things, you're not going to take any of this with you when you die. And you will, because we all will.
Mm.
And so if you're not going to take any of it with you, then maybe the achievement itself doesn't matter as much as the path you walk to get there. So in this cycle of being aware and then taking a step and then being aware and then taking a step, maybe it doesn't matter if you ever get to where you thought you were supposed to be going, because simply in the going, that's your life right there. Yeah, it's something that I try to live and often preach, which is find the process you like. Find the living that you actually want to do and live, and then it becomes so much more sustainable and the results will come.
Also easier said than done.
Sometimes, yeah, and sometimes totally the opposite. It's much easier to actually do than to talk about, which is that we actually overcomplicate it so much, and sometimes just getting back down to basics. I had a call with a client not too long ago, and they were in a bad way, wanted to leave work. This job is the worst, blah, 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 blah. And I was thinking, like, okay, I get it, not liking your work right now. And I can see 5 or 6 different variables that lead into why you might not like your work right now, and another 5 or 6 or 10 variables that lean into why you're not happy right now. So before you blame it on your work, maybe you ought to clean up some of this other stuff. Like maybe don't spend an hour on Instagram a day, right? And this sort of came up in the conversation, and I reflected on it afterwards, and I thought, I've been spending too much time on LinkedIn lately. And so since that conversation, I've leaned away from LinkedIn, leaned away from my screens, leaned away from Sportsnet and all of my TFC blogs and whatnot. And it hasn't been like a clean break, but I've really reduced my exposure. And my God, it's made a world of difference to who I've been and how I'm showing up and my natural creativity and my mood and my ability to focus on things. And so sometimes enjoying the process is way simpler than we think it is. You don't need to do anything complicated. Just cut out some of the bad shit. And if you're not sure if it's bad, then just try it. You can always go back to it later if you decide that it was worth the cost. Great.
Beautiful. Having had sightlines into your business and your vision, I know that what you're building is intentional and quite big. If everything you're building succeeds, and here's a nice three-part question for you.
3 part. I better write this down.
Yeah, exactly. If everything you're building succeeds, Paul, what changes about the legal profession? What changes about the people inside of it? And what changes about the coaching profession?
These are good questions. Let me sit with it. So, the really interesting backdrop of my own business is I don't know if you've heard about it, but right now there's this thing called AI, which is sort of a big deal. And it is going to make real waves in the legal industry. It's already been making waves. And what it's done is it's taken out huge swaths of work that would have otherwise gone to junior lawyers. And so I expect the business model to change radically over the next number of years because people can't charge for their juniors in the way that they used to. And if they're not charging for their juniors, then where are the juniors going to get their training? How are they going to get good and end up being the next generation? So I think that the industry is already in the middle of one of the biggest changes it's ever seen. I think that where it will look different from my work is just the intentionality with which people navigate it and realize what is asked of them and how to go about intentionally doing it from the get go. Because up till now, the status quo has resulted in people getting trained and getting better, some people leaving the profession, some people leaving their firm and going in house. And that's all about to change. And so when you realize, like, okay, this is what the successful people had because they had this skill set, because this was what was asked of them, in the new world, they're going to need that skill set plus this minus that. How can we be intentional about building that right away? So I think that we're going to see a quicker path and more direct path through to the end result as a result of my work. I think that the people inside are going to feel more agency because they have now been part of that path. I want to be like this, and there I my will be done, and it is done. And I think that when you start to feel that extra agency in one aspect of life, it often spills over into others. And so I have noticed that when we are feeling like we are not resourced enough, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough happiness, we're far less likely to be generous with others. Either generous in our interpretation, generous in our time, generous with our money. And so I think that if we want to make change in the world, we need to be putting people back into abundance, both externally and internally, especially. And I think that the work will help do that. Like, even though, yeah, the successful associate is about success, it's not about the inner work, it's not about that, but yet that pathway to success has so much overlap and prerequisites to that same journey that people would take on the inside. So I do think that even though I'm focusing on a specific slice, that it will make a big difference in the people who choose to walk the path that I'm setting out. And what changes about the coaching profession? I think that AI has changed a lot. I think that people immediately started sounding more professional. And then I think now we've all read so much AI generated words that we refer to AI slop as like a new category of writing. And in this world of AI slop, there is even more value for someone who's speaking as a human, direct and from the heart. And so I think that there are people who are using AI coaches already. And the value then for a person isn't necessarily to be more like an AI coach, it's to be more themselves, to be more human. And I hope that if coaches take anything either from my own journey or from my work with the legal profession and other white collar professions, it is that the pursuit of excellence is a worthy endeavor in and of itself. And that if you find a process you like about pursuing excellence, one day you're going to look up and realize, like, shit, you're being interviewed on the Coach's Chronicle.
Yeah, I'll never say never, but I can't imagine I'm going to be ever interviewing an AI coach for this magazine.
Yeah.
Final question, a one-part question.
Ooh.
If you could share one piece of earned wisdom with a new coach entering the industry today, what would it be?
It's funny. I was actually just chatting with a new coach a month ago. So I'm trying to actually think back, like, what did I say to her? And I think I try not to say too much because I realize that so much of what we think is true just happens to be the the lessons we've pulled from our path. Like for instance, for me, I've been coaching for 8.5 years. That's wild. Wild. And if I knew at the beginning that that's how long this journey would take, I don't know if I would have done it. Right. But just because it took me 8.5 doesn't mean it wouldn't take someone else too. I think if I were starting again, I'd get it done in two. But I don't want to necessarily give the advice to someone like this is how I would do it to get it done in two instead of in eight, because that 8 year journey is what's brought me here. So um, I guess people need to ask themselves whether they're making a business of it or whether they are making a vocation of it or both. If you're making a vocation, just the pursuit of excellence, pursuit of mastery. And if you're making it a business, you'd be wise to sell what people want to buy. I think I spent a long time just being a generic life coach, and not that many people want to work with generic life coaches. Like, if you have a tumor in your head that needs to be removed, you don't go to your family doctor. You go to the surgeon that specializes in tumors, those types of tumors being removed from heads, right? So there is a lot of power that comes from niching down. And I resisted that for a few years. And then the few years after that has just been a constant evolution of how I embrace the niche that I've chosen and eventually maybe the niche that I'm creating.
Beautiful. Paul, in the 6 or 7 years that I've known you, it's been an honor watching this story arc of you creating this practice, the books getting written, the research being done behind them, who you are today and how you're serving, standing up on stages and killing it as a speaker. Thank you so much for your time, for sharing parts of yourself and your business and what has led you to this place. It has been an absolute honor, and I am grateful to call you a friend and a colleague.
Thank you. There's something else that I want to say, which is look, I am one of the best coaches I know. And there's someone else who I'm talking to right now who's also one of the best coaches I know. And so I do think I'm putting it here into words right now that at some point you got to be on the cover of the Coach's Chronicle. And it would be my privilege to interview you, should I be the one that fate nudges you towards asking when that moment comes.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that big time. For everyone tuning in, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for listening to Paul and the wisdom and uh, the man behind the research. Grateful to have you here with us today, Paul, and thank you so much. I wish you continued success with your books and your practice and the amazing positive effects that you're having on the legal industry as well.
Thank you. I appreciate it.